What I'm going to talk about, just to finish this sort of subject up, is that in this case, remember I mentioned I've got multiple subtools, and so the way this one's organized is very simple. I basically sculpted grooves in just using, I think, a radial symmetry and just damn standard brush. And then I warped this, I believe, through the deformer panel, just using something like skew or inflate and masking part of this. And so what I have is the low res is already here, the high res is there. So what you'd have to do is if you do plan to keep some of these parts kind of separate or floating and not directly dynamesh them together, you will eventually want to create polygroups and start unwrapping. So for me, I'm going to use the select rectangle brush, isolate the back half, hit Control W. I had this weird issue earlier, so I'm going to go to geometry, or sorry, polygroups, and try to do auto groups. There we go. So now there's technically, it may look the same, but there's two different polygroups, so I can use that to do a quick unwrap. So that's going to be this part. So I'll go to Z plugin, just click unwrap quickly. You can go to the teeth in this case. Again, I'll go to the lowest subdivision, so I'll hit Control D to do that. Sorry, Shift D to go down to the lowest res. And then again, you can try to maybe isolate these. I'm going to switch to the select lasso brush and just hit Control W and do roughly the same thing across here. Control W, and then you can just quickly unwrap that. For my last piece, you may need to be strategic about some of these things, as I mentioned before. So this last piece is actually kind of composed, the knocker plate is composed of, it was done very roughly, it was kind of just done as a quick sculpt. So you can see the mesh is a Dynamesh, and then I have these little spheres sitting on top. So you can try to Dynamesh, but in something like this situation, let me just turn up the transparency mode. In something like this situation, Dynameshing this or merging these two, I will probably merge these two parts together, so I will do a merge down in this case. But if you try to Dynamesh it and Z-remesh it, it'll probably come out really messy. So what I wound up doing, I'll just show you by loading the tool, is I basically merged or appended a cylinder and then did a custom edit on that. So I'll show you that just by jumping ahead. And that I just did with Z Modeler. So I did a very, very basic, if you can take a look, I Dynameshed these parts together. And then I went and essentially created my own tool, which I then, right, so this is basically what I built with a cylinder through polygrouping and extruding and Q-meshing. And then I overlapped them. Just like I did with the other part, I basically had my rough Dynamesh version, or my high-res Dynamesh version, which I think is this one. Yeah, this one's all Dynameshed together. And then I did a project all. So I could delete my other projections. I divided this mesh up until it was high enough resolution to capture all that detail. I'll take this thing, I'll delete the Dynamesh. So I'm basically left with all, right, let's go to solo. Let's make sure all the tools are visible. I'm literally left with everything that can be reduced to a simple low-res mesh. Now, what you can do if you want to see them all in low-res is say all low. It drops everything to low-res. And now my total poly count is going to be somewhere in the close to 5,000 poly range. So what you want to do is if you want to unwrap all of these at once, let me just make sure my Maya is closed. I'll go to all. So you can say go Z all. So it's going to send all the lowest subdivision levels of those models at once. I'll quickly do an unwrap. Okay, so there's my base object here. There's the other object here. So if I grab them all, you can, as I mentioned earlier, you can actually unwrap multiple objects as if they were one object. So they're all kind of laid out here. I'm going to go to UV shell and just do a quick layout. So it should kind of pack everything into one nice, neat square. Like so. I'm going to actually also go to unfold because I want to make sure anything, you know, this is that cylindrical piece here, right? It's not perfectly cylindrical. It's got a bit of a thickness and a thinness to one area, so we do want to kind of split that like so. And right now you see the split is happening along here, so if you don't like certain seams, you can just go move and sew, and then I would often try to hide my seams in a place where it's less visible, right? So I'm going to double click through there, go to the cut tool, so that's shift right click cut, grab all my shells, re-unfold, so it's going to give you a new, there we go, nice flattened out UVs, and then I'll just do a quick layout. Now, one thing I mentioned to the other class is that you can do some really amazing things with UVs. So for this assignment, I do want the objects to basically be packed into one UV layout. But if you're in a production, we can pretend this is, you know, something that you want to put more detail into certain areas. You can actually lay out one piece so it fills your whole workspace and then offset it. That's just a side note that I want to mention. It's something that's done a lot in high-level productions, or where we have, so there you see that piece fills that area more. And then in the toolkit, let me just dock it here. You can go to transform and offset by a whole UV tile. So I set this to 1, and you can offset this over here. So the idea in production sometimes is that you can break up one object into multiple unwraps and multiple textures. And so when you have a film like Godzilla, I probably mentioned it before, but the artist on that actually broke up this. A single mesh of Godzilla was up to 20 million polys, but in low res, they broke it into about 40 different 8K chunks. So they actually would take a section, fill the area, offset it, and they would do a bunch of offsets. And so they could then bake up the texture for the whole creature in super high res. So that's how we can work around certain texture limits. But for us, again, that's more of just a side note. What I ultimately want from you guys is just to have one UV space. I want to see the UV shell layout like so, and then you're going to submit the normal map as well. So like I said, in a lot of lower budget productions, or when the object is less important, less featured, or less in close-up, even if it's made out of multiple parts, we would often treat it as one unwrap, one texture. Okay, so now that that's done, I actually want to go Z back. Remember to kind of bring all this information back. And sort of like what we did earlier, right? If I can go to each, I just want to make sure I'm in 4K resolution, so I'm going to set that in UV map. And if I go through and hit, you know, maybe I hit normal map. Let's see here. You know, if I go to create normal map, it'll kind of only fill in those areas, right? So it is a bit of an issue. So if I try to create normal map here, right, it's only going to show up on kind of this one little section. So again, let me just make sure my GoZ is all set up and proper here. There we go. So sometimes just to check, I'll go to polygroups and say auto group with UVs. Now what you can do, instead of baking out each of these individually and then just going into Photoshop and trying to stitch them together, ZBrush does have a little system called multi-map exporter. So what it'll do is literally check each and every piece of mesh. So if I go to Z plugin, multi-map exporter, I'll set it up for normal. I want all the subtools and I want to merge them. So for each individual subtool, instead of it just, right, if I just go to this mesh, oh, I guess I didn't do UVs on those teeth. I thought I did, but let's just go and create planar, and I'll try to do an unfold on these. If not, let's do this. I was wondering what was going on with those teeth. I'll just double click these edge loops. So this is another quick way to do this. Go to cut, go to shell, and I'll grab the shells for these and do a quick unfold. There we go. Grab all the shells and then do a new layout. So this is what's great. You know, even if you miss a piece or if you have to update something, you can quickly go back, unfold things, and then get things laid out proportionally. So there's those little chiclets. And now I can close this up. Again, I want to make sure I'm back in object mode, and I'll send all this back out. Go Z. And it should be sending over here. There, so it should be updated, and if you do auto group with UVs, you should see that update. So like I said, I oftentimes will do preliminary UVs with the UV Master and ZBrush, and then I may tweak them or even just leave them. but you can use the best tools or the tools that you find more comfortable in either ZBrush or Maya or both. So as I was saying, you know, instead of going through and baking the UVs for each separate piece, the normal map, and then trying to stitch it together, so this would just be the teeth. Right now there's no detail in the teeth at high res, but yeah, let me just put a bit of noise on these things. So I'll just kind of put a little alpha, take a very, very light intensity. Oops. Maybe too light. There we go. So just give it a little texture there, create normal, and you'll see it show up. Right? Might be very hard to see, but it's just at the top of that. Okay. So like I said, instead of having to go part by part, baking the normal map out, and then trying to go and essentially, you'd have to go to clone, which sends it over to the texture, and then going to export. Very, very simple way to do this. We want to just make sure under geometry we set, sorry, not geometry, but subtool, all low, Z plugin, pick the type of map you want. In this case, it's normal. I want all subtools. I want to merge maps. I want a 4K resolution. And you can set the map borders. Remember, I set it to 16 pixel. I do the same thing here. And then under export options, we want to go into normal map. We have to make sure these three are on: tangent, smooth UV, and smooth normals. So what smooth normals and smooth UVs does is that it's going to look at this mesh. Right now, your low poly is actually technically very faceted. It's very low poly. But the way Maya is going to see it is actually going to generally auto-smooth this thing. And so that's what the smooth normals will do. Tangent is the type of normal map that we're creating. And smooth UVs will also, when you smooth a model and divide it, the UV edges can actually tear apart. This is a weird thing that happens in 3D. So sometimes if you ever see a model and it's got little weird gaps along the UV shell seams, it could be because the smoothing is pulling the map apart. And so this option is also intended to prevent that. And we want to, like I said, subtools on for all subtools, merge maps, and we simply hit create maps. It's going to ask you where to locate it. So I'm going to call it Satan's Knocker. And then it's going to generate, and it does it for each layer, and then it's going to intelligently stitch it together. And then I'll show you the final setup inside of Maya. And this is basically how I'm going to want you guys to set up your files at the end. So it's going through, it's doing each subtool, going from its lowest res, comparing it to the high, and baking out a normal map. So now I can say, I'll say all, which will send this over to Maya. And I believe that's all in here. There we go. So you can keep them separate or you can merge them together. In this case, I'm going to make sure they all have the same material sign, which is a blend. Again, I like to make my blend dark and shiny. Go to bump map, load the file, set it to tangent, load the file through there. So I'm going to go into my, I think this is in my D drive. My models. There we go. And this should be, I think it's this one here. Yeah. Click on that. If you hit 6 on your keyboard, it's going to show you the texture preview. And then I'm going to switch this to raw so it displays properly. I just need to make sure, actually. Let me just double check something. Just want to make sure I'm opening the right file here. So I'll just check my details, because if I'm not loading the right one, yeah, I'll just delete this one here. Okay, so I'll make sure I'm loading the correct one. There we go. Because that's all synced up with the UVs, right? Okay, so that looks okay for the most part. I think some parts are a little bit glitchy, so let me just double check my UVs. Yeah, by the way, sometimes if you're kind of going back and forth and tweaking UVs, I oftentimes may actually just create a new scene to make sure that I'm getting the right UVs from this model. So I'll just reset Maya, hit Go Z to make sure that it's not pulling the wrong set of UVs. So I'll just try that one more time. Assign blend. Again, darken it, shine it up. Go to file, and then I'll load that texture. We'll hit 6 to preview it. So always a good idea to double check. I think, yeah, something weird happened in the baking of this, I think. I may have forgot to send over the UVs properly. So if this happens to you, not a big deal. I'm going to actually do a new layout. Go Z it back, go back through multi-map, and then rebake. So that looks okay for now. I'll pause the video now. So I'm back in here. I'm going to load my new texture map, which I think is based on the correct UVs now, which should be this. And there we go. So it is showing up properly now. So again, if you're not careful with the version of the mesh you import or export, you can get some weird results. But I just laid out the textures, and there's most of, I don't think I have quite all my details from the low res there, but virtually all the details are there. And again, if I want a smoother silhouette, I can just select all the mesh and hit 3. We get a smooth version of that, which looks pretty good for the most part. One last thing though, if you decide to keep this as one mesh, you can very simply combine it, and it'll work just the same way. So it can work as a single mesh, and I would delete the history. You can also delete all these extra selection sets as well once you've deleted history, and you should get a nice clean mesh. So that would be a simple prop, and then if you ever need to, you can just take that object and extract it out. Oops. Okay. Sorry, extract, not duplicate. So extract, and then you've got that object there. So it's still technically using the same UVs, it's still in the same spot, but separated.